welcome back to our game design course. Today we're going to be taking a look at Chapter 6, the Chapter 6 slides of our course textbook. And we're going to be taking a look at the cultural layer, which is the final layer in our layered tetrad design framework that we've been looking at over the past few chapters. So some of the topics that we're going to be covering are going beyond play. That's going beyond and outside of playing the game. Cultural mechanics, cultural aesthetics, cultural narrative, and we'll cover authorized transmedia as well in this section. Cultural technology, and then cultural impact. So first, going beyond play. What happens after the game? Does it affect the players? Does it affect society? How have games affected your life? How have you affected or changed games? I'm sure many of us who are gamers will be able to think of at least one or two games that have greatly affected our life, whether it was when we played the game, like the time in our life that we played the game, or maybe it's just the game was that good that it affected our lives and how we went about our day to day after playing the game. So these are really good questions to ask and think about when thinking about the cultural layer and what happens with your game after the game is said and done. And the cultural layer explores all of the aspects of a game that exist beyond play. So the cultural layer exists at the intersection of the community of players of a game and society in general. If you remember our graph, it's actually on the next slide, the image. So we'll relook at that in a second, but we looked at an image that showed this a few chapters back. And it covers both the effect of the game on society and the effect of society on the game. And players have more agency than the game's developers in this layer of the tetrad. So here is that image I was talking about. And you can see the cultural layer is at the intersection of the community of players and society. And this is where they meet, is the cultural layer. And the divisions between the four elements, that's mechanics, aesthetics, narrative, and technology, are less distinct in the cultural layer than they are in, say, the dynamic layer or the inscribed layer. So let's take a look at each of those elements of the cultural layer in a bit more depth, and we'll start with mechanics, as we have been for the previous layers. So cultural mechanics occur when players take ownership over game mechanics. And an example of this would be game mods, right? Players repurpose a game with their own mechanics. And some examples that are given here are creating Dota from Warcraft 3, or using the creation kit in Skyrim to create new characters and quests. Many of us who have played Skyrim before, I'm sure, have gone back and replayed Skyrim, probably with a lot of mods added. Or maybe the first time you played Skyrim, you already played with some mods added. So those are two examples of game mods, but obviously there are many games out there that have mods, and I'm sure that at some point in your life you have played games that have been modded by players to have their own mechanics, right? And then custom game levels are another example of cultural mechanics, because it's actually the one of the most common cultural mechanics. And this is where players create their own levels on which to play a game. And this can be very common for FPS games such as Quake, Doom, and Unreal. But games like Little Big Planet and Sound Shapes rely on players to expand their level offerings. Another game that has custom game levels is the Hitman games. They actually allow the player to create custom contracts within the game. So you'll see a lot of custom game levels if you've ever played the Hitman games. And it's important to note that this differs from house rules, which are dynamic mechanics. We discussed those in the previous chapter when we discussed the dynamic layer. In cultural mechanics, players significantly alter the original inscribed mechanics of a game, right? So it's not a very simple house rule type of change of the game. It is a great change that really alters the original inscribed mechanics of the game. And cultural mechanics also cover instances where game mechanics affect normal life. Here's a question to ask. Have the actions that you've taken while playing a game ever bled into normal life? For example, losing friends over games of diplomacy or risk. I hope this one has not happened to you, but it is an example. But being more aware of your environment and surroundings after playing an intense FPS. If you're a big FPS gamer, this may be something that has affected and bled into your normal life. Being aware of how conspicuous you are after playing a stealth game, and looking for fun ways to climb buildings, especially Catholic churches, after playing Assassin's Creed. So these are all examples of ways that a game may bleed into your normal life and influence your actions that you take in your normal everyday life. Now we can take a look at cultural aesthetics. So, cultural aesthetics occur when the community of players of a game make their own art. And we have some examples of that here. So, one is game art, right? Players create new art to replace the existing art in a game. For example, you may look at Minecraft has some mod packs which just change the art. They're called texture packs. They change the art of the game. So this could be an example of players creating new art to replace the existing art that is in the game. And then we also have fan art, right? Fans of the game create art outside of the game that was inspired by it. And cosplay is a specific kind of fan art where the fan dresses as a character from the game. So cosplay would be included under the fan art section, but fan art is not limited to cosplay. There are other forms of fan art, such as maybe drawings, paintings, digital image creations. The list could go on. And cultural aesthetics also covers gameplay itself as an art. So the elegant play of a highly skilled player can be seen as art, which makes game designers similar to crafters of instruments. Next, we can take a look at the narrative element in the cultural layer. So players take control and make their own game stories in cultural narrative. And an example of this could be fan fiction. So fans of the game will create narrative outside of the game that was inspired by it. I don't know the entire validity of this because I haven't really played the games at all, or seen or heard too much of the lore. But from what I understand, a lot of the Five Nights at Freddy's lore actually comes from fan fiction, from fans of the game creating narrative outside of the game, and inspiring some of actually the fan fiction to become actual lore of the game eventually. And we also have narrative game mods, and this is where fans create their own stories within the game. For example, Mike Hoy changed the Legend of Zelda The Wind Waker to refer to Link as she for his daughter. And players adding their own quests and stories to Fallout 3 or Skyrim is another example of narrative game mods, right? So I can speak to Skyrim because I've played Skyrim before and some of these narrative game mods, but there are a lot of mods that you can add to Skyrim that actually add different storylines, quests, narrative to the game itself. And then finally, we also have Machinima, and this is fans using a game engine to tell their own story. And an example of this would be Red versus Blue, which was a comedy series shot inside of Halo. And cultural narrative also covers stories that are told by people and news media about games and gameplay. So some examples of this would be New York Daily News, and what role might video game addiction have played in the Columbine shootings. There's a woman's story about how playing Journey with her dying father helped him come to terms with his impending death. And Stop Teaching Our Kids to Kill by Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman. So how can you as a designer affect the stories told about games? And it's important to note that authorized transmedia is not the cultural narrative element of the cultural layer. So authorized transmedia is not in the cultural layer, and it would actually be the inscribed layer of a new product made by the owners of the original game IP, right? So here in the inscribed layer, you can see it's sort of connected, but its own distinct thing. And authorized transmedia would be like films, posters, books, figures, maybe, that were created by the people who created the game, right? The developers of the game, the designers of the game. So it would be non-fan made, developer made content of any kind. And then our final element in the cultural layer is technology. So game technology, this includes the game technology that is used outside of games. And increases in visual fidelity of game technology have led to better graphics and frame rates across many other fields. Real-time graphics are now used in everything from medical visualizations to pre-visualization of films. And then there's also player-made game tools, where players can make tools to help them play games. So, for example, there are mapping applications for Minecraft. There is DPS calculators for World of Warcraft, and if you don't know, DPS stands for damage per second. There's aimbots for first-person shooter games like Unreal and Counter-Strike. And there's also fan-made game guides like those at gamefaqs.com. And these would all be examples of cultural technology. Now let's discuss cultural impact. So it's important to acknowledge the positive and negative effects of gaming and gameplay. So some positive effects would be improved multitasking skills and improved situational awareness, and there are several other positive effects. And one potential negative effect of gaming and gameplay could be game addiction, but there are obviously other negative effects that could occur. And so after Brown v. Entertainment Merchants Association, games are now protected by the First Amendment. So what will we do with that protection? So prior to this ruling, the ESA, which is the Entertainment Software Association, promoted studies that showed positive effects of gaming while downplaying studies that showed negative effects. And as a protected medium, will we now take more responsibility for those potential negative effects, or will we prey on people's weaknesses? As a result of, I believe this is pronounced Maguarian versus Apple Inc., Apple had to pay millions of dollars to families whose children had been tricked into paying excessive amounts of real money for in-game content. Right? So, obviously, there can be a lot of positive impacts of games, such as some of the ones we listed in the last slide, and there can be negative impacts of games, like game addiction, and also the fact that some games do prey on younger audiences, especially in regards to microtransactions and such. So it's important to take these things into account when creating your games, because obviously if you create your game to have these type of negative effects on people, then it's not very good. It would not be a good idea. And quickly, a summary of this chapter. This chapter is a bit of a shorter one, but in the cultural layer, players in society have more agency than the original game developers. And the cultural layer is defined by this shift in agency. And players take control by creating things such as fan art, game mods, machinima, multiple different things, a lot of which we covered earlier in the slides here. And society has control of this layer by telling stories about games, possibly without having played them. And this layer is the only one ever experienced by non-players. So be aware of the stories that may be told about your games and plan for them. And that'll do it for chapter 6. But in the next chapter, chapter 7, is where we will be talking about acting like a designer. So some of the questions we'll discuss are: how do designers approach a problem? What is the iterative process of design and how do designers come up with new ideas. So that'll do it for our chapter 6 lecture, and I will see you guys in the next one.